This is episode 2 of Thursday's Lessons, wherein I attempt to hopefully give some lessons to everybody listening, at least something to think about, and hopefully expand a viewpoint or two. And today we're going to be talking about Standing Rock, right? You know, it's a big deal right now in the news and everything. So, more than that, though, I think it's a very important issue, not just because of what it is right now and what it represents at the moment, but also because of what it represents of our history. Everything that we've done that has led us up to this point. And, well, if we look at all of that, I think we can draw a few very important conclusions about American culture and some of the greater issues that don't just plague the native population, but all of us. And we're just seeing it most clearly evidenced by the native people's plight. I am Thursday.
I am Varmint.
And we are here to hopefully teach you something. So, to get this right off the bat, we have Standing Rock, which for anybody who doesn't know, maybe you are under a rock, right?
Right.
This is a protest going on by native populations in North Dakota against what's called the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is basically an oil pipeline that seeks to run oil all across the country. And one of its main routes, the point of contention here, is that it wishes to travel through Native American territory, and especially some of their sacred sites, such as sacred burial grounds and the like. And, well, I don't think I need to entirely point out, but I will, the dangers of pipelines, considering we've had, 2 or 3 now burst in the last year alone and start spewing millions of gallons of oil every which way, and
causing states of emergency?
Oh, yes, and I don't particularly blame the native populations for going, do we want this thing running right through the middle of our ancient sacred spaces that are, sacred?
Not to mention the fact that there's the double standard of why they're proposing putting it through their land first place.
Which is that, bunch of, to put it bluntly, a bunch of white people said, we don't want that, and so...
Because we see these exact same dangers.
And so since we don't want that, the company is like, they don't want it. Where can we put it? Oh, we run it through native territory. They can't do anything about it. And history repeats itself.
Because they're doing plenty to try and protest against it.
Oh, yes. Well, to set the tone, I think, for how this discussion is sort of going to go, let's talk about the newest news piece we have, Wherein, basically, on the date of July 5th, they're going to start being able to kick out people on the protest grounds. They're going to be able to basically accuse them of trespassing and arrest them. They're going to clear out the campground for the people protesting through legal action. And, well...
They've already been spraying them down with water, using tear gas, concussion grenades.
Although they deny that part.
Even though the doctor said that, I'm pulling, grenade shrapnel.
Pulling pieces of concussion grenade out of her arm. The protesters did it to themselves, clearly.
With their own explosives that
they somehow had. Wait, what? Okay. Now, basically, they're going to start kicking people out of the campsite for the protests as a sort of what seems to be stopgap measures against protesting in general. If you have nowhere to stay, if we clear you out of the place you sleep, how are you supposed to stage the rest of your protests? It's a pretty obvious method of defeating the opposition from their home front. Clear out the place they recuperate, and they have nowhere to go. And so the protest sort of breaks apart, at least in theory.
That was the whole idea, was that this was supposed to be kind of hush-hush, and it still kind of is in the mainstream media, until these most recent events have escalated to the point that it's actually shown up a bit. But that's the idea, is let's just kind of out of sight, out of mind, and just do what we've always done throughout history.
Exactly. And here's one of the really, fucked up points about how I think a lot of other people are seeing this struggle. It's a point of false equivalency, where we have both sides basically being accused of more or less equal amounts of wrongdoing. Whereas two sides are in conflict, and for some basic reason, people generally want to assign both sides wrong in the conflict. Oh, well, you're fighting with this other person. Well, you need to apologize, and you need to apologize. There's this whole, like, equal reconciliation idea. And to make this point, I want to reference a particular article, the Standing Rock, A Time to Listen, Not to Spout, which is a good article in its beginning, because it basically talks about the historical culture of hatred and damage that we have with the Native American peoples. And one of their good quotes here, is it's essential that we try to shut up and just listen for a change, addressing fellow white people. And, they say right after that, the truth is that white people don't know very much about Indian lives and Indian ways of seeing, which is very true. That a lot of our views on Native Americans are very influenced by our own propaganda about them more than the facts. But where this article screws up, in my opinion, where it makes the point I want to make, is if you read this article and go down, there's a point where they talk about, reconciliation, and they talk about, starting with the paragraph that begins with the line, "It is time for a new spirit of reconciliation between the two cultures." And what that suggests to me is that both sides have done wrong, which they go further to make plain face this equation by their next paragraph down, bold line, "Both sides need to explicitly renounce the use of violence."
This is the exact same thing of a bully who just beat up some victim who is weaker than them, and then taking the blood that's on their hands and wiping it on their own face when an adult shows up and saying, "Well, I was defending myself."
Well, it's more worse than that to me. It's that zero tolerance policy that came afterwards effect, where you have, oh, you were in a fight with somebody? Well, you're both suspended. But he beat the shit out of me and I didn't do anything. Nope, you were in the fight, you're suspended. It's automatic wrongdoing on all sides of the conflict, regardless of what happened.
It's an inequitable approach because it's an equitable approach to an unequal situation.
Now, to put it another way, right? Very simple, I think, to understand. If somebody draws a gun on you and attempts to kill you, right? Mm-hmm. Unprovoked, right? They're robbing you or whatever. In some situation, you pull a gun out and shoot them first, right? Or they miss and you shoot them, right? Guess what? Those acts of violence are not equal. One of them is aggressive. One of them is defensive. The person shooting back to save their own life is not as guilty as the person drawing their gun first to kill.
One is provoked, one is unprovoked.
Right. And not only is it provoked, it is defensive in nature. I am taking an action to preserve my own life against an unwarranted threat. Which, isn't that part of what, like, America, sort of, its legal system is built on, is that idea of defending, you have the right to defend yourself. That's a big deal to a lot of people, is that, yeah, you're on my property and you come to rob me with weapons, I can shoot you and that should be legal because you assaulted me in my home, right? That a lot of us can agree that that makes sense even. Mm-hmm. Now, when we take this principle, though, and apply it to this particular conflict, we see that once again, this is a fucking unequal thing. This is unequitable in every sense of the word.
This is taking a position of neutrality in a situation of injustice.
Yes, and we have a comment here, I say. That's a good one, right? All the nonviolent tactics did was get the government to rubber stamp their oppression.
Nonviolence protects the state, yeah.
Which is... I love nonviolent tactics and protests, right? They're a good thing, but you need to measure achievement against tactics, right?
Well, what it is I like how Microneta on Idea Channel, they talk about violence and how it is the usually aggressive but restriction of someone's power. And when you look at the idea of using violence in that kind of a context in response to violence being imposed against you,
yes,
it obviously makes sense. And again, it's when it's defensive in nature.
Yes.
Because the thing is that you're using violence that isn't aggressive in response to violence that is.
And as commented here, It is the right to defend yourself that is also a justification liberators use to throw off oppressors, because it's a sociological form of that same analogy. It is you as a people defending yourself from aggression from, the source in power. Mm-hmm. It's basically the same in a just larger social context as defending yourself from being robbed, wherein no one would argue that, a Jew in Nazi Germany was wrong for shooting a, SS officer coming to take them away. That was a direct act putting the life of their entire family in immediate and irreversible danger. Had they gone with this person, they were dead. Just that simple. So, at that point, when your entire people, your populace, your entire culture is threatened by something, right? I dare say that, yes, you have the right to defend yourself by any means necessary to prevent your complete destruction. Now, here's the thing, though. It's not as though the native populations face an opponent that is honest with its intentions. See, that's the thing, is a crook in your house with a gun is honest. He is pointing a gun at you, demanding your stuff. He is letting you know from the get-go, I'm willing to use violence to take things from you. So you might want to just give them to me. No compunctions.
If we wanted to make this analogy appropriate, you'd have to also be some form of snake oil salesman.
Like, you'd have to be the burglar that breaks into the house and say, but you gave me a key last week. You just don't remember. And, oh, by the way, I'm on your will.
Harkening all the way back to last episode, I'm your guest. You'll be delighted.
Yes. See, here's the thing. We have a history of breaking every single agreement we have ever made with the native populations and ever. As America, we make a treaty with the native peoples that says, hey, we took your land, sorry about that, but you're
Not
cool
sorry.
in that new place. Yeah, over there by, that new place where we sent you to, yeah, that's cool now. So great, we'll leave you there and we won't fuck with you again. You have gold. Oh, see, that's a problem, because suddenly, no, it's a treaty. We're taking your land, go over there, and we won't fuck with you when you move there now.
Except we totally will
from
before you even moved there.
Oh, wait, there's oil there. Keep moving. That's basically that.
Oh, wait, there's land there. Keep moving.
Eventually, I remember, and I would have to look for it, somebody who basically commented that had the progression of treaties been allowed to continue, right? Mm-hmm. It might take a while to find it, but had that progression of treaties breaking and relocation continued, eventually the natives would have been asked to relocate to the bottom of the ocean. And that's basically how that went. Was the native peoples were moved from their land, told that, okay, we took your land, sorry about that, like I said, and told that they would be okay in the next place, continuously.
Sorry, not sorry, the whole time.
And then every time we're sorry, again, for this, aggression. But this time, we'll leave you alone.
Our actions always speak louder than our words.
I mean, hell, 2007 is a particularly dark date if you want to play facts, because America voted against, and let's quote a particularly important line in this document, the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as a distinct peoples, and shall not be subject to any act of genocide or any other act of violence. America voted against, basically, the rights of indigenous peoples in 2007. Later, we did change our vote. But the fact is, in 2007, we voted against recognizing the basic human rights of indigenous populations. Like the right to not be killed or subjected to violence. Like, we were not sure about that one.
One of only 4 nations who voted this way and later changed our vote in shame.
Yeah, as we should have been ashamed. The very least, I think, in human decency, we can all agree upon, if nothing else, is that humans should be free of genocide, right?
And acts of violence.
Yeah. At the very least, right?
No, we can't even agree to that, though.
No, because we're too busy killing our native people still.
We're still too busy arguing over whether or not they should have personhood at all.
So, to bring up another point, right? Another interesting point about how this is not just with our, Native American populace, the general Native American Indian populace that most people think of, the far less spoken of Hawaiian population, the native Hawaiian, not American Hawaiian, who were, overthrown in the last 100 years by America.
Became a state back in the 50s?
Yep. For what? Oh yeah, farmland colonization, literally. If you look up the history on this, it is completely about American plantation-style farmland people taking over more or less Hawaii. And then when Hawaii says, hey, you are completely exploiting us, they turn around and go, hey, American government, we're being attacked by the Hawaiians because, we're stealing their stuff and land and taking advantage of them. But that point aside, they're attacking us and please help.
Always the double standards.
Yep. And so I think it has been very shameful to America itself for the native Hawaiians to join this, because it should be a reminder. It should bring shame to white America, the white, colonial sort of indoctrinated America. It should bring a moment of shame to them to admit that, yes, we completely destroyed a native population's sovereignty specifically for profit. Specifically for the interests of a collective few wealthy people who wanted to control this land for their own benefit.
It comes out of our history of colonization.
Oh, it does, because that was a colonial act if there ever was one. And what, it's like...
The whole reason we wanted Hawaii was because it was a asset for our military.
Oh, yes. Which was why we started there. But it was the collective farming and the collective settling that occurred afterwards that actually made Hawaii lose its native sovereignty, really, because we colonized it. We made it white. And now you have native Hawaiians having to protest things like the new, observation tower they want to build in Hawaii because they want to build it on top of one of their sacred spaces. And it's like, I'm not against scientific building normally, but, we really could place that on places other than entire, disadvantaged tribes' sacred sites. I think we can do better than that.
It's very simple. We just value their spaces and their land and them as people, and then we don't do things like that.
It's like, imagine if you, have a grave plot, right? There's a graveyard where your family's been interred for a few generations. It's important to you. You could even use the word sacred, perhaps, if you're religious. And someone says, hey, I just want to bulldoze this thing and put up at a parking lot. Is that cool?
Don't we have one of those for, soldiers in, DC or some shit?
Oh, you mean Arlington, right? That big old national cemetery that basically is sacred to our nation? Now, imagine if somebody's like, yeah, I want to put a parking lot there. Everybody would flip their shit. Rightly so. Because this is a place where we commemorate our lost dead who mean something to us. That should be relevant. That should be important. That should be honored, even in cultures that don't respect that religion necessarily. Because it's that idea of empathizing, right? Where you look at another person and say, I might not understand your ways, but I can understand your feelings. You feel that is important and sacred. I don't have to understand why to know what that means. Quote Adventure Time. Some people are just built differently. You don't have to understand it. You just gotta respect it.
It's almost like this is elementary bullshit.
Literally, here. Right?
But we follow a tradition of imperialism.
Actually, you want to make it dumber than elementary?
Oh.
What do you learn in kindergarten? Share.
Right. So about that land, we're just going to keep taking from you and taking from you and taking from you. There will be a video in the description about that, too, that just details the history of how, at Standing Rock, we've just taken their land again and again and again through treaty. That's the thing. We both violate our treaties while at the same time...
That's a funny comment.
What?
Where are all these pro-life crusaders to defend the lives of indigenous people? Well, generally speaking, the pro-life crusaders are only pro-life before it's born.
George Carlin said, no neonatal care, no daycare, no Head Start, no school lunch, no food stamps, no welfare, no nothing. If you're pre-born, you're fine. If you're preschool, you're fucked. Because all they want is live babies so they can be made into dead soldiers. You can,
graveyards, in my opinion, too, are useless. The point, though, is a respect point for the people that feel that they are useful and have invested hundreds of years of their culture into revering this thing.
And again, the supposed idea that we grant them ownership of this motherfucking land and then, oh yeah, we're just taking that back.
And see, that's the other point. Really, once you own a piece of land, short of I'm going to build an atomic weapon on it or something immediately hazardous to everybody around me, I'm generally a person who respects the right of people to use their property as they see fit. Like, you own that thing. You purchased it. You bought it. That land is yours. Or we, said we gave it to you. This is yours for all time. That means you should be able to do with it as you see fit.
This is manifest destiny.
There's a concept, all right.
Right?
Right there, by the way, is like, manifest destiny is the manifestation of this ideology, this hatred towards everything that is not us. Because it basically stated, if you're not familiar with manifest destiny, it was the idea that the American people were literally destined by God to take over all of America. There was a campaign this doesn't even extend to just, native populations. There was a campaign in the 1800s called the 5440 or Fight Crusade. And it was about taking over Canada to the point where it matched the line with Alaska so that we had a unified America. Because manifest destiny, that was ours. All of America belonged to us because God or something. That was the sort of ridiculous arrogance that formed our policies with the native peoples. This idea that, that land under you, we can say we gave it to you, but everything literally belongs to us already. So this is a token gesture to appease you temporarily. If you think about it like that, it suddenly makes a lot more sense, I think. That idea informs every policy we have ever made with the native peoples. This idea that, yes, we can give you this land, but literally the only reason we're giving it to you is because we don't have enough people yet to populate it ourselves. You're just holding on to that for us until we get to it. And once we get to it...
But people excuse it as the equivalent of what we currently do when Walmart needs to build a parking lot somewhere and eminent domain.
Yeah. Which is, by the way, to segue into another point about, white people problems on this.
That's the thing. Even if they say, for eminent domain, we need this pipeline type idea, right?
Right.
The thing is, that's only under the assumption that we don't do what we should of transferring our infrastructure towards renewable and sustainable energies in the first place.
Well, that's a whole different issue, but at the same time, the pipeline is a symptom of it. Mm-hmm. Where,
it's but that's the point, is that, there's intersecting ways of solving the issue at the root.
Look at the chat right here. Not only don't we need it, we need to not do it. We don't need the pipeline. That's the thing, is, it might give us a bit cheaper gas. Okay, is that really all that fucking matters? Is that it?
Are you saying that we're doing all these violent acts against indigenous peoples entirely for the profits of a few people?
That's all of American history.
What?
Look at the overthrow of Iran for a brief moment, getting off of native people, sure, but it makes the greater historical point, where we overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran to institute the rule of a autocratic, bloodthirsty dictator who wanted to sell us cheap oil. By the way, that's where the Ayatollahs came from, if you weren't aware, was they were the people that, helped overthrow our Shah, the bloodthirsty dictator, with the promise of a theocratic rule that ruled by the religion that the majority of the people there already believed in, which sounded like a much better alternative suddenly than our bloodthirsty Western dictator who wanted to give us their oil. By the way, here's that fun point, just a hint at something we're going to get to more at the end of this, where we talk about the boogeyman of the situation, the causes and effects. All of these things end up biting us in the ass. Just want to say that real quick. The overthrow of Iran's government ended up creating the Ayatollahs, who are vehemently anti-Western and anti-Western influence in the Middle East. So a lot of the problems we have today in the Middle East are based on the very thing that we helped the United Kingdom do there in the 1950s. Our problems there today are built out of that. By the way, anybody know that the name of the Mujahideen, or known now as Al-Qaeda? Check Rambo, I believe it's Rambo 3, where the credits, credits the brave freedom fighters of the Mujahideen in their struggle against the Soviet Union, back when they were our friends because they were fighting our enemies. So we gave them weapons and arms and stuff, and then suddenly, once they kicked the Russians out, they were like, hey, these Western imperialists aren't any better. Let's turn these cool weapons on them now. Every time we do this game where we attempt to destroy a native population through various methods, it always ends up coming back to bite us. And to talk about what I was going to originally, the white people problems, right? Because you mentioned eminent domain.
Yeah.
The point here is that there's a lot of anger about this pipeline. And it's not just from the native peoples, because I've heard people complain, it's just these people complaining about it, and everybody else is fine with it, so why do we just listen to them? Mm-hmm. And it's no, there's actually a lot of uncovered, by the way, is it not covered by most media, anger at this about farmers. A lot of farmers have had whole tracts of their land taken by eminent domain for the building of this pipeline. And some farms, I've done some reading on this, have been sliced basically in half, right down the middle by this pipeline running through it. And these farmers are basically given a pittance for this land and told, them's the breaks. We just are taking this. Now, why do you think we're not covering that? Because I think that's an important point. Why do you think we're not talking? Because they're willing to talk about it. The people who have had their land cut apart by this pipeline have been very openly vocal about their, completely unfair treatment and how, that they were basically just told this is happening.
It's an illustrative question. The lack of coverage that's been given to the story in general, despite the intrigue that is there. And, you've got a bad guy and a good guy. You've got a good narrative to set up. You've got violence against peaceful protesters. Right. You've got an actual story that you could be reporting on, but they choose not to.
Generally speaking, yes. And it's once again, I think, because of the economic interest. That's what this always comes back to, that old saying, follow the money, right? Because that's what this is about. It's about profit. It's about money, which is getting framed in a lot of different issues, which, by the way, quick hint for another show in the future. You want to look at most every political problem, every problem ever? Follow the money.
That's what I was getting at with the root issue of climate change and all these other issues in the first place is what, people? Survey says capitalism.
Yep. Like I said, hint for a future show, right?
Right.
Capitalism, the show.
Jesus fucking Christ.
I know. There's not enough beer in the world for that show.
Amen.
But, so we got asked in the comments here, the chat, about the Oregon standoff. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that is very much something we're actually just about to jump into here. Because it makes a great contrast, which is probably why you brought it up, that it makes a great contrast with how the protests of the Dakota Pipeline is treated. Because they're in many ways paralleling each other, these two quote-unquote protest movements. I say quote-unquote for the Bundy people.
Right.
But, all right, let's treat them legitimately for a moment. Fine. Doesn't bother me,
Well, that's kind of the problem, is the false equivalence between them. So taking it as given.
But if we even treat it as the false equivalency, right, it still falls apart, which is the point I'm about to make. Which is that, okay, so they're both protesting for legitimate reasons. I'm going with it for a moment. And what happened, though? Let's say we treat them equally and say they're the same thing, right? What happens? The reactions are not the same. Regardless of how you look at this, how we treated the Bundy people, the protesters occupying that place, has no relation to how we are treating the Native Americans protesting.
We just set up blockades to let them go in and out and get their supplies in and out.
And what was their big issue? We're running out of Twinkies. And what's happening to the Dakota Access Pipeline people? They're getting sprayed, blasted, bombed, shot. And these people had to deal with, oh no, we're in a different building than we're normally in.
And by the way, they were acquitted.
I know, they were acquitted. You know what? All the people arrested on this protest, do you think they're going to get acquitted for the Dakota Access protest? You think they're going to just be released? No. We all know it's not true. We all know they're going to attempt to slap charges on these people that are absurd and try to force them to plea bargain into some time. At the very least, if not just railroad them. We know that's how it's going to work. We've already seen it happening. We've seen journalists arrested for trespassing.
So consider, we have white people who are breaking the law outright, who get acquitted.
Outright.
And we have the indigenous populations who are trying to enforce the law against the police.
Being prosecuted.
Persecuted.
Both.
Yeah.
That's my point right now, is the legal different. Like, for a moment, like I said, we're doing the false equivalency, but treating it as accurate.
Yeah.
Which still falls apart because the reaction is not remotely equal. The Bundy protesters were basically, were one of them even like, one of them got shot, right?
Yeah.
But because he drew first.
In this case,
that's the only reason he got shot, was he drew a weapon. In this case, we have people being shot for standing with signs.
With rubber bullets.
Which, by the way, are basically metal bullets with a rubber coating. Look it up.
Very purposely in the heads and around the extremities where they can do real damage.
Yes, because if you get shot with a rubber bullet, by the way, in the arm, you have broken arm most likely. Just making a point that these things, rubber bullets, there's this perception that they're knockout bullets or something. They hit you with a rubber bullet and you just fall down and are asleep for a while, or you've just been stunned, These things can kill you quite easily, actually.
There's hit right here with
there's a reason why now, if you look at the official, releases of the police's, methods, they call them less than lethal methods. Because they are less than lethal, but they cannot call them non-lethal. Because they're not non-lethal. What is something that is not non-lethal? Tell you. Potentially lethal. So,
what are rubber bullets?
Potentially lethal. By the way, when asked about concussion grenades on that list, they refused to say anything altogether. Do we use concussion grenades for that?
Next question.
Yep, basically. About the woman who had her arm almost blown off, who says she was hit with a concussion grenade, that the police's official story is, the protesters were trying to make a bomb and blew themselves up.
Mm-hmm.
Although the doctor, like you noted, said, hey, I'm pulling out pieces of what looks like, fragmentation or concussion grenade style shrapnel. This is a grenade. I don't think they had one. And the police allege it was, I believe, I could be wrong on this, just a note, but I believe they alleged that it was a propane tank that they were attempting to weaponize and blew up, which would leave very different wounds than what has actually been shown. Now, again, to sort of cap off that contrast, in my opinion, right, between the Bundy fuckers and, the native population's protest here, is that their protest was about taking advantage of the government. I don't care how you feel about the particular issue, in my opinion, because it's my show. This was about a bunch of private people who basically were feeling particularly entitled, and they basically just said, hey, we don't need to pay taxes on the land or anything because it's ours. We own it. Why are we paying taxes and stuff? We can just not do that. And a bunch of people said, hey, we support their right to completely screw over the government that supports them. So they don't get any of my sympathy, first off. Now that we're in my opinion for the moment. They don't get any of my sympathy because their cause was based on selfishness and this whole sort of, libertarian style, self-sufficiency, I'm my own man sort of ideology that is completely bullshit, pointless, and dumb as shit. And, these protesters were basically standing up for ideas that were, in my opinion, reprehensible. And even if we remove my opinion for a moment, they were standing up for points that are not legally viable. They were protesting something that had no legal grounding, no particularly strong arguments in favor of, just, we think this is how it should be. versus the native populations protest, which they're trying to enforce the multiple treaties that we have signed over the hundreds of years saying that we respect their sovereignty and that they can use their land as they see fit. So, I think in reality there's no real equivalency. That we have, one, a legitimate protest being fought against by what is, at this point, in my opinion, an illegitimate occupying force, versus an illegitimate occupying force fighting against the legitimate law.
The fact that people
See,
can
right
even
there,
equate these two.
Here we go.
Yeah.
In the comments even. You know, a group with guns invades a space that they have no right to, driving the people there that are rightfully there out. Yeah. And yes, an unarmed group defends their rights to their own land. I mean, I think the point that needs to be made over and over again is that this is unlawful. By the treaties we have signed with these native peoples regarding the use of their land and our respect of it, our actions with the pipeline are effectively unlawful. The fact that the courts did not rule that way is more of a bias. It's pretty simple. There's a signed contract. We just don't want to follow it because it's now inconvenient. But the point is, largely unarmed, even if they got some rocks and whatever, right? Maybe a gun, one of them, somewhere.
Yeah, police say that, we've had projectiles lobbed at us.
You know what y'all got? Tanks, water cannons, sound cannons, and guns up the ass, armor.
Fuck you.
Yeah, fuck you.
You're very purposely using nefarious tactics such as water cannons in the middle of the night when
By the
it's
way, it was
below
27
freezing.
degrees.
Yeah.
Which is called hypothermia. Death,
what was it,
potentially.
like over 200 people injured?
Yeah. Yeah, completely. Over 200.
Just because, we feel like injuring peaceful protesters for getting in our fucking way.
Well, it's more that they're inconvenient. That's what all of this is actually about, and that's the most infuriating part of it all to me, is that this is all actually about inconvenience. They could move the pipeline. They could. This is possible. Quite a few third-party people have looked at this and said, yes, you could build this around. It would be more ordinary, sure, but it could be done. But they just don't want to. They just have decided this is where it's going, come hell or high water. And let's start moving into the boogeyman. Let's start talking about what's wrong with all of this and what this comes to as a core. Now, what I'm going to talk about first is our great President Barack Obama and what he had to say about Native Americans before this whole thing. And I quote, "As we celebrate the contributions and heritage of Native Americans during this month, we also recommit to supporting tribal self-determination, security, and prosperity for all Native Americans. While we cannot erase the scourges or broken promises of our past, we will move ahead together in writing a new, brighter chapter in our joint history." Does that sound anything like, slightly, what we're doing here? Now let me finish that quote. "Now, therefore, I, Barack Obama, President of the United States of America, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the blah, 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 do hereby proclaim November 2010 as the National Native American Heritage Month. I call upon all Americans to commemorate this month with the appropriate programs and activities, and to celebrate November 26, 2010 as Native American Heritage Day." What just passed? By that date, he proclaimed, while we are persecuting and attacking the native peoples.
Actually, that's today.
Yeah. Oh, it is today. How about that? What are we doing right now, then? What did I just talk about in our new news segment? So, as we commemorate Native American Heritage Day, it seems like America's going to commemorate it the way we always have. Fuck the native people more.
Gonna close down their camp.
Close down their camp. We're going to build the pipeline whether they want it or not. We're going to attack them, drive them away, scatter them to the winds. Because that's how we have always proclaimed our Native American heritage. By destroying the shit out of it. So, let's talk about why I call that like a boogeyman, right? The specter behind things. Is that this is that doublethink, that double speak that we use to address these things, where we talk about these issues, right? But historically speaking, because history and our knowledge of it informs what we know today, right? What that does, right, our history, is teach us that we are not systematically evil or bad. What it does is individualizes these behaviors, makes them remarkable. Oh, that time a slave owner beat his slave? Whoa, that was fucked up. When in reality, the book should be talking about how, oh yeah, in this systematic and institutionalized industry that was slavery, death, abuse, rape, and murder were common. That would be a good way to put it. We talk about it in an individualized, exceptionalized form, though, wherein everybody who remembers their history books, you would always hear about individual stories by individual people's names, not the institutionalized and systematic form of this entire thing perpetrated these crimes on this entire people. No, you would hear about this particular explorer did this to this particular group of people. And what does that do? It individualizes the systematic. It takes the faceless and gives it a face that it doesn't earn or deserve. It says that, hey, the settlers and discoverers were not savages to the natives. It was Christopher Columbus. Oh, no. He was the bad guy.
See, what it does is it humanizes the issue to us because that's how we learn. That's why they do that for those commercials with, won't you please help? They give us an individual face.
Right.
See, that's why they do it in the textbooks
but
Thursday.
Here's the problem. Everybody who looks at that, though, individualizes the problem as well as the sufferer.
Oh, see, if I just give my little bit of money, then I can
save Ariana. And that's all you care about then. You saved Ariana. Good job. What about the other 1.7 million starving people in that region?
What about the reason that they're in that situation in the first?
No. Individualizing the problem individualizes the solution, which is to say it makes the solution irrelevant. Because if Joe, slave owner, is the problem, then we're not talking about slavery anymore. If this one issue, the Dakota Access protest, is the problem, we're not talking about the systematic destruction of the native peoples through history anymore. When we individualize and exceptionalize the issue, we take away its systematic and its normalcy, the systematic context and the normalcy that gives it. We take it away. We treat it as exceptional. We treat it as unique rather than being common and normal.
And it also devalues all collective action to try and address the problem, which is, again, devaluing the same thing that we're trying to deal with. Like, it's devaluing these same protests that are meant to address the problem that is there due to those systemic issues. But even that, it's an acute individual protest, and it can only do so much. And we're still not actually getting at the systemic issues at the root. Again, that was mentioning things like capitalism earlier. These issues that are monolithic are the things at the root of these problems. I mean, that colonialism, imperialism, these were global issues. And they're recent in history, and people don't have context for that. That we're just coming out of... When did the Ottoman Empire fall?
1919, I believe.
Yeah.
After World War I, the Ottoman Empire fell.
That's how recent these things are in history, and yet people don't have a context for that.
No, the Ottoman Empire is ancient history to most people.
Empires are ancient history to most people.
Except we had an Ottoman Empire and through World War I.
Except we still have colonies.
We still have empires that go by different names. Like, think about how we cover history as a totality, right? We cover it by specific names, specific dates, specific points. We talk about specific instances, specific battles to make an illustrative whole. Except, generally speaking, I think that defeats the point, because by talking about one particular thing and treating it like the signpost for everything, you generally lose that point that this was normal. Because, again, if I talk about one instance, and only one instance, it sounds exceptional. Mm-hmm. If I say, somebody just got shot, right? That sounds, oh my God. Now, in the middle of a battlefield, because I didn't give any context, that's kind of normal. Mm-hmm. But if I just say this particular person got shot on this day, it sounds exceptional. It sounds like Why did he get shot? What was going on? That's weird. When rather, oh, he was shot in a battlefield because this was a whole period of war. Oh, well, then him getting shot was normal and expected. So I would like to point out a little excerpt from Modern Misogyny, right? Basically, it's talking about this point. They analyzed the depictions of slavery in textbooks, right? And they found something undeniably systemic and structural, that U.S. slavery was framed in individualized terms. The text failed to show how racial violence operated systematically to oppress African Americans' opportunities and social mobilities in the United States. The textbooks do not present the slave trade and slavery as based in our fundamental institutions such as law and religion. Rather, the perpetrators of violence against enslaved African Americans are falsely portrayed as individual actors or bad men who are deviant, not necessarily a reflection of the larger social, economic, and political structures. And when discussing resistance to racial violence, stories focus again on the individual, isolated efforts that concealed the organized and systematic ways that enslaved Americans and free blacks acted against their social conditions. Basically, by talking about Harriet Tubman like she was this lone figure that appeared out of the mists, we removed the idea that the African American slaves were systematically and constantly protesting and opposing their own slavery. We make it exceptional, the mundane.
It's something that it was commonplace, but
the way we are treating it is that it is not commonplace, that it is absolutely rare.
And that context inside of history, then again, when you've got privilege today, it's just like, oh, so yeah, we can just see how we have reached equality today. Because things weren't that bad back then.
See, here's the thing. This falsehood in history, this difference in portraying things, basically creates this illusion that individual efforts and actions are independent of the society around it. That, oh, you can just raise yourself up and achieve things and it just can happen because you made it happen. It ignores the society around the event. Now, if we change this, things change in general, right? A point made by the book Lies My Teacher Told Me about when you reveal the truth of systematic structural disadvantagement or discrimination to people. In particular, this one example is talking about how poor people, their guilt about being poor can be alleviated. Let me read it here. Teachers may avoid social class, as in classism and rich versus poor, out of a laudable desire to not embarrass their charges. If so, their concern is misguided. When my students from non-affluent backgrounds learn about the class system, they find the experience liberating. Once they see the social processes that have helped keep their families poor, they can let go of their negative self-image about being poor. If to understand is to pardon, for the working class children to understand how stratification works is to pardon themselves and their families. And so, what this means for this particular issue, Standing Rock, is that we need to stop viewing Standing Rock as just Standing Rock, as a singular protest against a singular event. It needs to be understood instead that this is yet another protest against yet another encroachment from the government since we have engaged with these people.
This is only one manifestation of a larger systemic issue and a history that we continue to play out today.
And as such, as long as we look at this as a singular issue, as a one-time event, basically, that this is an abnormal thing that has occurred, we will continue to miss the actual significance of what's happening here, which is that we're just simply continuing on with a history that we have never really abandoned or ever stopped. For all of our pretty words as a country, we have honored Native Americans since the nation's founding, by the way. In fact, to make a point, right? We signed an agreement, right? 1988.
That's inside of our lifetimes.
Yes, to acknowledge the contributions of the Iroquois Confederacy of Nations to the development of the United States Constitution and to reaffirm the continuing government-to-government relationship between the Indian tribes and the United States established in the Constitution. Whereas the original framers of the Constitution, including most notably George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, are known to have greatly admired the concepts of the 6 nations of the Iroquois tribe, on and on from there, is basically a document discussing, released by our government, officially affirming our understanding that our very nation and its concepts were born from study of the native tribes, that our very foundations were not just Greek and built in Grecian democracy, but were also built from the study of the tribes of the native peoples and their culture, and how they have influenced us, and how, to use that hot buzzword, we have, in essence, appropriated a lot of their cultural concepts, self-governance and such, that we apply to ourselves and treat it as new, although they had been doing since long before we had arrived. And then we turned around and treated them as the savages, after we took from them ideas.
It's that absolute hypocrisy where they are treated as savages throughout history, while we're the ones savaging them.
So, we're getting close to our ending point here, right? And so, I want to make a few good points, right? Bringing up a particular Cracked article about the founding of America and what happened there. There's this common perception, right, that we overcame the great tribes of the natives, right? That we showed up here and through dint of superior technology and firepower and whatever. Most historians now basically agree and understand that there was, before the arrival of, what we consider the main colonists, the Pilgrims and the English colonials and all of that, there was a massive plague that ripped through the native populations, decimating, except not because decimation, by the way, only means 1/10. But taking up to 96% of the entire Native American population down before it was said and done. More or less, when our colonists arrived, our official colonists, the British colonists that made up America, when they arrived, there was basically this open land. And if you read a lot of the descriptions from various colonists, how they basically talked about these built areas that almost seemed perfect for gardening and growing of crops and everything, that wasn't an accident. Nature didn't just happen to grow farmland out of forests. They were finding the abandoned farmland of the native peoples that were completely wiped out. To use the example they use here in the Cracked article, using your history books to understand what America was like 100 years after Columbus landed there is like trying to understand what modern-day Manhattan is like based on the post-apocalyptic scenes from I Am Legend. By the time our official settlers arrived here, we had come back to a ghost town where most of the natives were dead, and that we still had a problem colonizing against the remnants. Had we, I love how they put it in this particular article, you have to assume that the Native Americans at full strength would have made shit powerfully real for any palefaces trying to settle the country they had already settled. Which, imagine that. But there's also that point of the native culture that was primitive, right? They were primitive people. That's a commonly understood thing that is completely untrue. Mm-hmm. Where they had a vast trade empire. They had cities that rivaled London. They had places that traded all across the continental America, which is impressive because we had problems doing that in the 1800s even. The point I'm trying to make by bringing these things up is that what we have done is, since the beginning of our relationship with the native cultures here, is we have reframed the entire argument between our cultures in a manner that is only flattering to us at every step of the way. When we came here, we portrayed ourselves as, basically these people fighting against these natives, right? In this powerful force, when really we were dealing with the scragglers. We portrayed them as being savages compared to us and not understanding of science and reasoning and all of this, except they had effectively similar culture to ours, just different. But at the same time, we portray ourselves as somehow being connected with all of this, which is, I think, the most insulting point of all, is how much America likes to dip into native culture, while at the same time disparaging it. It shows that we, as a people and a culture, generally just don't respect their culture. We don't respect, at least with a healthy respect, anything about them.
You're saying we don't respect a culture we genocided?
Yeah. Shocking that. I'm saying that we still don't.
Right.
That we still don't respect them.
We just
despite all of our...
we don't even know the fucking history of how we genocided them. Just how many of them there were. Just how bad the conditions continue to be.
No.
None of it.
And we don't talk about it. Because we would rather absolve ourselves of the guilt by forgetting.
Thank God for Indigenous Peoples Day finally being popularized more recently. But again, it's like that more like, talk, like from Obama. They're like, we're going to say all the pretty words, but what are we going to do in your time of need? We're going to shoot you with rubber bullets.
Yeah.
And ignore the fact that you're being sprayed with water cannons and not actually do anything to help you.
No.
When we are the ones ultimately responsible for what you're going through in the first place.
Yes. And so... Let's draw a lesson or two from this, huh? This whole Standing Rock issue.
As you are always wont to do.
I think lesson number one, ultimately, should be that the narrative created by the victor is pretty much never the truth. History is written by the victors. That's an old saying because it's fucking true. When we look at our history, we need to take it with a grain of salt. Because we were the victors in that fight. And so, of course, we're going to disparage the people we destroyed. There's no historical group ever, almost, that has not done that.
Well, it's a simple matter of actually listening to what scientific historians actually say versus what we see in the popular media that's told to us. The myths that are in popular culture.
Well, it's like the Wild West. The whole thing is a myth.
Right?
Cowboys and Indians. Whole fucking thing's a myth.
Right here on our screen, a Viking with like huge horns on their helmet,
which they did not do, because that would have been fucking impractical as all get out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, we just imagine them that way because certain ceremonial helmets usually used for the dead had things like that on them because the dead weren't going to be rumbling too much anymore. So you could put a bunch of giant badass horns on their helmet.
You could make it all ornate.
And so, another point I just want to make really quick, and then I'm going to link it to a lesson here, is that the entire history, the entire narrative we have constructed about the American colonization is a lie. That from the point of Christopher Columbus discovering America is a lie, to the point about our settling of America and how it went being a lie. We love to include the Croatan mystery, which is not a mystery to anybody who realized that, an island in South Carolina filled with a native tribe called the Croatan suddenly started having blonde hair and gray and blue eyes emerge in their genetics about a, generation later after the settlers disappeared. Yeah, no mystery at all to anybody who actually has studied this. And it's this all hokey, like superstition-y sort of history, folkloric in sense, that we have created around our colonization of America. Look at figures like Paul Bunyan. That's a mythological figure.
Mm-hmm.
Like Johnny Appleseed, that has become a mythological figure at this point. We have mythicized our own origin story, which is unsurprising. Basically, every culture in history does it. From, all the way back to ancient Hammurabi. Every culture mythicizes its origin.
But think about what that says, considering we have modern history. Despite that, but those things are still there.
Yes. It's that there's a competing set of viewpoints between history and factual history.
Mm-hmm. The shit with Washington and such.
Yes, the cherry tree and all these things that we construct, these parables that we create out of our legacy. History is, as commonly understood, very much a nebulous thing. And if I were to take, lesson number 2 is going to be is that ultimately you have to question everything that you understand about history. Because, well, it may not be true. The Siege of Troy, right? Everybody knows what the Trojans, who they were, right? Helen of Troy and all of that. Most likely a complete myth, by the way. There was no Troy, most likely. Or if there was a real Troy, it fell long before that supposed battle even happened. And so, the whole story is just an allegorical myth for a struggle against another empire. And that's what history is very prone to doing, is taking on allegorical myth-like status. And when the victors are writing it, you have this allegorical myth become the myth of the ascendancy of their people, every time without fail. Look at Japan's myth in their own beginning. It's about their people rising up from the gods themselves and being better than everybody. That is a very simplistic view, I admit, but still it holds true, especially for state Shintoism. But the point is that history needs to be understood from a factual standpoint. The mythologies and the legends of it need to be stripped away so that we can have an honest interpretation of the events that led us to where we are now. Because right now, an honest and unbiased, I think, interpretation of history shows America being very much in the wrong in every sense of our dealings with the native peoples from the beginning to right now, to today.
We're absolute narcissistic abusers, if you want to make it an allegory like that.
Right.
I mean, we're absolutely in the wrong at every single stage, while we say all the best things, while we do all the worst things.
Right. It's that abuser logic. I hate you because I love you. We don't hate these people. Of course not.
No, we reaffirmed their right to exist after 2007.
Yes. It's that thing, though, where, by the way, the last lesson I want to draw from this, and it applies to everybody, not just disadvantaged people, because anybody can become disadvantaged with a moment's notice. I want to say, never trust entirely the institutions that run things. And that might sound conspiratorial or whatever, but it's a healthy distrust I encourage. The official message should always be questioned before accepted. The official history should always be investigated before being taken as fact. The party tagline should always be thoroughly researched before spouted. Because right now, we have two histories of America. One is the real history. The history that includes things like we genocided the Native Americans. We were just one of, more than 24 countries that contributed to a great victory in World War II. We did not just go over there and win it. Then there's American history, which says that we kicked ass straight through history all the way up to here, and everybody's like, oh my God, I don't even know how they do it. And until very recently, unfortunately, we've had a focus on that second form of American history, where we talk about how great America was at everything and how much everybody else was just sucking until we showed up. Because look at American history as we talk about World War II. There are two versions of World War II's history, as well known by most historians. There's the American version where, oh my God, everything was screwed until we showed up. And then there's the version where Britain basically is the main character. Sorry, America. We showed up as... We're the cavalry in the movies that always shows up when it's like, yeah, we're still helpful, but God damn it, you should have showed up 20 minutes ago. Really? Now you're showing up? I have this shit halfway under wraps now. Hate to say it, guys, but, there was a lot of other players in that war, Britain being one of the biggest ones. Britain had the Rommel killer, their General Sherman, There's so many... Yeah, Russia, who lost more civilians than everybody else combined, opposing the, German invasion with literally every man, woman, and child they had, and fighting for single buildings for years. Yeah, no, we can also have that version of history where America just showed up and saved the world. But see, that's the point I'm making here, and that's the point we should take from Standing Rock, besides, genocide is fucking bad, and really, why haven't we learned this lesson? What the fuck? Oh my God. Besides that, important point, what the shit, people, I think we should take from it the idea that history's narrative is flawed, and that if you want to have an informed opinion about the struggles between cultures, you need to actually understand the cultures that are warring. and not just go upon the history of the victors and say that those who have lost before are simply losing again because, well, they're wrong. Which is an attitude I have seen from some of the, I dare say it, more supremacist groups out there who are basically just like, well, you know, shit sucks for the natives, sure, but they deserve it, right? They kind of suck and are, like, stupid and stuff, so...
Well, people buying into the false equivalences, people who are ignorant of the history, people who don't give a shit about the actual state of the situation.
Because how do we portray them in history? Savages. That used to be the word, in fact, for, you know, the native peoples of a land you were colonizing. They were just savages from the get-go because, well, look at that funny stuff they're wearing. That must be that they're primitive because they're not in English petticoats. That was the basic attitude. Oh, they're not wearing English-style fashion? They must be primitive savages. So, in general, take from a situation more than just what one side says. Always. Look at both sides. And one side's generally going to be wrong. And often in history, both sides will have wrongs. I'm not going to say... From the beginning, I criticized false equivalency. That's not to say that that's never true. But you need to carefully look at situations before you go running your mouth off about, oh, both sides need to stop the violence. When, in fact... That's like, again, take the schoolyard fight I talked about earlier, where both kids are in a fight, but one of them was getting the shit beat out of him, and the other was doing the beating. To say that both should be punished equally for fighting is a false equivalency. And that is exactly, literally, what is going on here. You have a military group attacking a group of... let's say, at least 90% peaceful protesters, right? At least. With full military gear, and people are saying, well, you two need to stop fighting each other. That's like, a one-armed person fighting a black belt in karate. And someone says, whoa, you two need to chill out. No, one of these people clearly has control of this situation, and the other does not. And I dare say that the military of the United States government, with its, powers, is a little more well-equipped for the struggle than the native people sitting in a camp. Just throwing that out there, that at their full mobilization, I doubt they're going to pose any threat whatsoever to this group in seriousness, our military. Let's be honest. Not going to fucking happen. They can't. We could blow them all up with a missile if we really fucking wanted to. What's the threat they actually pose to our sovereignty and security? None. There's no legitimate, arguable threat that they pose to us beyond they remind us of what we have already done. They remind us of this persecution that we continue. They are unfortunate reminders of the costs of our aggression and expansion.
They're people who we don't want to admit are people who are in the way of our profits.
Exactly. And by the way, just as a quick note for everybody out there, anybody can potentially be in the way of progress. Ask anybody who's been eminent domained out of their home for generations. Where suddenly you need a road there and, oh yeah, you thought you were part of the privileged. Oh yeah, no. Well, until today. Now it's your turn to suck it. And so, I think that pretty much concludes this. That's at least our opinion, our thoughts and feelings on this particular subject, and I hope that at least something in here was new to you, or that it has provoked some kind of thought for you, some discussion, or at least given you some talking points to say to other people on this issue.
There will be links in the description for your Patreon once you have it set up.
Yep. And all of our sources in the description, everything else.
Always remember, go to Captain Obvious at www.youtube.com/bobothursday, all one word.